A little over 1,000 years ago, on a small island in the Bahamas called Eleuthera, a woman was laid to rest in a cave. We don't know her name, we don't know her face, but we know she was there, because more than 1,000 years later, scientists reached into that cave, took a single tooth from her jaw, and pulled from it something no history book expected to find. Her genome, the complete genetic code of a woman who lived and died before Columbus was ever born. And when they compared her DNA to the people living in the Caribbean today, they found something that should have rewritten every textbook in the Americas. Her closest living relatives, the people on Earth who share the most DNA with this 1,000-year-old woman in a cave, are modern Puerto Ricans. Which is strange, because for 500 years, every book, every classroom, every encyclopedia has told us the same thing about her people. The Taino, the first people Columbus ever met in the Americas, were extinct, gone, wiped out within a few generations of 1492. There is just one problem with that story. It isn't true, and her tooth proves it. This is the story of the greatest disappearing act in the history of the Americas, a people declared dead who never actually died, and how modern DNA finally found them, still here, still carrying that woman in the cave, in millions of living bodies right now, maybe even yours. Open almost any history book written in the last 5 centuries, and you'll find the Taino filed under a single, final word: extinct. Here is the version everyone was taught. In 1492, Columbus landed in the Caribbean and met the Taino, a people who had lived across the islands for centuries. And within just a few decades, the colonial chroniclers wrote, enslavement, war, and above all European disease had swept them away completely, an entire people, erased almost overnight. That single word, extinct, got printed into textbook after textbook, and it stuck for 500 years. But if you stop and really look at it, the story never made sense. Because a people who truly vanished don't leave their language stamped across the map. They don't leave their words sitting in your everyday speech. And they certainly don't leave their blood in millions of living descendants. The Taino did all three. So here is the real question this whole story turns on. If the Taino were declared extinct, but their language, their words, and their DNA are still everywhere, then what actually happened to them? And maybe more importantly, who benefited from telling the world they were gone? Hold on to that question, because the very same evidence that proves the Taino survived also reveals how the lie of their extinction was built. And when those two pieces lock together, the whole story turns inside out. But first, you have to understand who these people actually were, because that's the first lie that has to go. Forget the image of a small, simple people quickly swept aside by history. That picture is wrong, and it's wrong on purpose. The Taino were the master navigators and farmers of the entire Caribbean. Their ancestors had crossed the open sea from northern South America, island by island, and built a thriving civilization across what we now call Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. When Columbus first wrote about them, he described not a handful of survivors, but a people already flourishing across an entire island world. And here is how you know they never really left. You speak Taino words every single day. Whether you've ever heard the name Taino or not, canoe, hurricane, hammock, barbecue, tobacco, savanna, these are Taino words, carried out of those islands, into Spanish, into English, and straight into your mouth. The very name of the island of Cuba comes from a Taino word. So does Haiti. Think about how strange that is. We are told these people vanished 500 years ago, and yet their words are so deeply woven into how the whole world speaks that you used one of them this week without knowing it. That is not the fingerprint of a people who disappeared. That is the fingerprint of a people who were absorbed, renamed, and written out, while the world went right on speaking their language. So how does a civilization like that end up filed under extinct? It didn't die. And this is where the DNA finally delivers the truth that the colonial records buried. For centuries, the entire case for Taino extinction rested on one kind of evidence: old colonial paperwork. Spanish administrators, counting heads, filling out ledgers, recording who was and wasn't there. But paperwork can lie, or rather, the people filling it out can. Bones can't, and genes can't. In 2018, a team of scientists published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, and they had done something that had never been done before in the Caribbean. They had sequenced the complete ancient genome of that 1,000-year-old Taino woman from the cave in the Bahamas, the woman we met at the very beginning of this story, the first full ancient human genome ever recovered from the entire Caribbean. And then they asked a simple, devastating question. If this woman's people really went extinct, then her DNA should hit a dead end. It should match no one alive today. That is not what they found. Instead, they found that her closest living relatives are the modern people of Puerto Rico, not a faint, distant echo, a direct, unbroken genetic line, running from an ancient Taino individual, straight through 500 years of colonization, and into a living population today. The scientists put it plainly. The Native American ancestry carried by present-day Puerto Ricans, somewhere between 10 and 15% of their entire genome, is closely, directly related to the ancient Taino. Read that again. The people the history books swore were extinct left a genetic signature so strong that 1,000 years later, scientists could reach into a cave, pull out a single tooth, and trace it straight to living human beings walking around today. The extinct people were never extinct, and it wasn't just one woman in one cave. Because here is where the story becomes something more than science. Here is where it becomes personal. When researchers looked closer at the DNA of people across Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, they found that the Taino bloodline didn't just survive. It survived most powerfully in one specific place, the maternal line. Your mitochondrial DNA is a special kind of genetic material. It is passed down almost unchanged from a mother to her children, but only her daughters pass it on again. It traces one single, unbroken thread through history, mother to daughter, to mother to daughter, back and back and back. And when scientists followed that thread in the Caribbean, it led overwhelmingly back to the indigenous women of the islands, the Taino women. Listen to these numbers, because they are staggering. In Puerto Rico, more than 61% of people, the clear majority, carry Taino mitochondrial DNA. Their direct maternal line traces back to a native island woman. In Cuba, it's roughly a third of the population. In the Dominican Republic, more than a fifth. The extinct people make up the majority maternal ancestry of an entire modern nation. Now do the math on what that actually means. That woman in the cave lived about 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years is roughly 40 generations. So if you carry that maternal line, it means 40 unbroken mothers stand between you and her. 40 women, each one handing that same thread of DNA to her daughter, through conquest, through slavery, through 5 centuries that were supposed to erase them, and not one link in that chain ever broke. For millions of families, this isn't abstract at all. It's the abuela who always insisted, quietly, we have indio in us. The grandmother, the textbook said was impossible. She was right. The paperwork was wrong. If uncovering the truths that history tried to bury is the reason you're here, take 1 second right now. Look just below this video for the red subscribe button and tap it. It's free, and it's the entire reason this channel exists. To follow the thread back to where it actually leads, not where the legend wanted it to end. Because now the two halves of this story are ready to lock together, and this is the part almost everyone misses. Here is the trick at the center of the whole 500-year lie. The Taino didn't have to die to disappear. Sit with that for a moment, because it's the key to everything. Under Spanish colonial rule, an entire people could vanish completely from the written record, without a single one of them vanishing from the earth. Here's how it happened. As the colonial system took hold, the native peoples of the islands were slowly reclassified. They married into mixed families. Their children were sorted into new racial categories on paper, categories that had no box marked Taino. One by one, they were quietly dropped from the census, not because they had died, but because the paperwork simply stopped counting them as Taino. And this is the trap that fooled the entire world for 5 centuries. Once the colonial records stopped writing the word Taino, later historians came along, read that silence, and drew the obvious, and completely wrong, conclusion. No more Taino in the records must mean no more Taino on Earth. Administrative silence got read as biological extinction. But those are 2 entirely different things. One was a filing decision, made by a clerk with a ledger. The other was declared, forever after, as a hard fact of history. A people were declared dead because a bureaucrat stopped writing their name. And ask yourself who that served. A colonial power that had claimed these islands did not particularly want a living, rightful indigenous population with a claim to the land. A people who are extinct cannot object, cannot inherit, cannot resist. Declaring the Taino gone wasn't just a mistake on a form. For the people writing the forms, it was convenient. And this is where the DNA becomes the hero of the entire story. Because the genome didn't just identify one ancient woman in a cave, it exposed a mistake that had been repeated, unchallenged, for 500 years. The genetics proved, beyond argument, that the people the documents had erased had in fact never stopped existing. They weren't extinct. They were misfiled. And when you really absorb that, the irony is almost unbearable. The Taino, the very first people recorded as going extinct in all of the Americas, turn out to be one of the greatest survival stories in the history of the Americas. Their words are spoken all over the planet, every single day. Their maternal DNA runs through the majority of an entire nation. Their descendants are, right now, part of one of the most vibrant living cultures in the hemisphere. They didn't disappear. The world was simply told to stop counting them, and the world obeyed for 500 years, until a single tooth, in a single cave, refused to go along with the story. For millions of Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Cuban families today, this changes something deep. Because now, when a DNA test comes back full of indigenous island ancestry, it isn't a shock, it's a homecoming. It's the scientific proof of what the abuela always said. It's the reason for the words, the foods, the faces that never quite matched the story of extinction you were handed in school. There is a whole movement now, people across the Caribbean and its diaspora, reclaiming the Taino identity that the paperwork tried to erase. And the science has finally completely caught up to what their blood had been saying the entire time. So here is the real question, the one this whole video has been walking toward. Do you carry it? If you have Puerto Rican, Cuban, or Dominican roots, the odds are far higher than you were ever told. And you can actually check. That maternal thread we followed, it shows up in your mitochondrial DNA as specific genetic signatures the scientists call haplogroups. The main Taino maternal lines carry the labels A2, B2, and C1. If a DNA test ever tells you your maternal haplogroup is one of those, then that thread in your blood runs directly back to an indigenous island woman, maybe even back to a cave in the Bahamas, 1,000 years ago. And that opens a question far bigger than one people. Because if the very first nation declared extinct in the Americas was never actually gone, just renamed, reclassified, and quietly written out of the records, then how many others were declared dead by the exact same people who profited from telling the world they had vanished? That is a thread we are going to keep pulling. So the next time you read that single confident word in a history book, extinct, remember the woman in the cave. Remember that she waited 1,000 years in the dark to prove them wrong. And remember that she didn't wait alone. She waited in the blood of everyone who came after her, 40 generations of mothers, holding the line, refusing to disappear no matter what the paperwork said. The Taino were never extinct. They were misfiled. And now the record is being corrected. One tooth, one test, one family at a time. So tell me, do you carry Taino or Caribbean indigenous ancestry? Did anyone ever tell you your people were extinct? And which nation should we uncover next? Who else was declared dead who never actually died? Drop it in the comments. Yours might be the next story we tell. And subscribe. Look for the red button just below and tap it, because there are a lot more buried people down here who were never actually gone. We're just the first ones counting them again.